So welcome to our first video talking about fiscal policy. So we know all about aggregate demand and aggregate supply, and we know all about monetary policy, unconventional monetary policy, the financial sector, the role of the Fed in the financial sector. And so in the next two chapters, which wrap up the semester, we're going to talk about the other main type of macroeconomic policy, which is fiscal policy. So fiscal policy is basically the federal government's spending and taxation policies taken together. And we'll see that when the government is collecting more revenue than they're spending, we say that there's a surplus on the budget. And when the opposite is the case, which is typically the case since the late 1970s, is a situation where the government is spending more than they're collecting in taxes, and we call that a deficit. So I'll talk a lot in this chapter about deficit spending and how to measure deficits, whether or not we should be concerned about the large size of the deficits, and then of course the relationships between deficits and the debt. Two different but closely related concepts. So we'll talk about all of this stuff in this chapter. This chapter deals more with some basic definitions and ways of measuring these things, so it kind of crosses through macroeconomics, a little bit of politics, discusses a little bit of the budgeting process by the federal government, different types of accounts. So it also covers topics that will be covered again in your accounting classes, in more detail certainly in your accounting classes, and some finance also. So we're going to talk about deficits and debt, and we're going to talk about the way that the government determines its budget. Okay. So here are the objectives for this chapter. I'm going to cover these objectives in two different videos. The first objective, which we'll cover in this video, will be to understand the basic budgeting process in the United States. So we will cover that in this video. Objective 2, be able to define the terms deficit and surplus, which, I just kind of defined them for you on the introductory slide. Really, when it comes to defining deficits and surpluses, it's not really quite that simple. There are a number of additional considerations that we'll have to talk about. Really, if you're going to measure the deficit or the surplus, you have to decide what counts as revenues and what counts as expenditures. And there are different considerations in defining revenues and expenditures that could lead to different measures of the deficit and or the surplus, as we'll see. And it's the case that there's not necessarily one right way to measure a deficit or to measure a surplus. What we do need to do, though, is use rules that reflect common sense, and we need to apply those rules consistently over time. I'll talk a little bit about that also, and some of the adjustments to a basic deficit and surplus that economists like to look at, and why they like to look at those alternative definitions of the deficit. Finally, there's an objective to learn the difference between deficits and debt, and understand why debt needs to be judged relative to assets, which is actually really tough to do for the overall economy, but I'll tell you how we kind of get around that a little bit. And why some economists are concerned about the current level of the U.S. deficit and the debt. So some economists, the U.S. debt is a fairly controversial topic, and the U.S. Deficit and the debt, some economists believe that we're at a tipping point where the debt is becoming large enough to impact our future macroeconomic growth and our future prospects. And then, of course, there are economists on the other side who believe that for an economy the size of the U.S. economy, and as stable as the U.S. economy has been, and as credible as the U.S. government is in terms of issuing debt and not defaulting on that debt, that our relatively high debt is something that we can easily handle. So we'll talk a little bit about that in Objective 3. It's just Objective 3 that I will cover in the second video for this chapter. So in this chapter, We'll cover objectives 1, we'll cover objective 2, we'll do some calculations, and then the second video, I hope, would be a little bit shorter, and we could just talk about the relationships between the deficit and the debt, and talk a little bit about why some economists are concerned about the debt to GDP ratio. Okay, so under objective 1, we said we were going to understand the basic budgeting process in the United States. So I'm just going to go through the basic political calendar, the fiscal year for the U.S. federal government, give you some ideas about, how the budgeting process works. And then we'll talk a little bit about what the government actually spends its money on. We'll look at a recent year, and we'll break down government expenditures into a number of different categories. And, the major breakdown of government spending is into what we call discretionary spending and mandatory spending. And broadly speaking, you can think about discretionary spending as spending on things like the EPA and environmental protection, or the Food and Drug Administration, or military expenditures. Those are discretionary, and they're determined in the budget on a year-by-year basis without any additional acts from Congress. And then mandatory spending you can think of as spending on entitlement programs like Social Security and Medicare and Medicaid. And those are mandated by law, and they can be changed, but they can only be changed by an act of Congress. Congress would actually have to change the law. So what you'll be surprised to see is that a bulk of federal government spending is actually in the mandatory category. So we'll talk a little bit about discretionary and mandatory spending and what the biggest spending components of those two categories are. And we'll talk, of course, also we'll talk about where the government collects its money from. Right? I guess that was up here. So let's talk about the federal government budgeting process. This is a flow chart of the annual budgeting process for the federal government. So a couple of things here. First, this budgeting process was laid out within the Congressional Budget Act of 1974. Okay, and in that act, the fiscal year for the federal government is mandated to start on October 1st of every year. So the fiscal year begins on October 1st, and it runs through September 30th. And this whole process is intended to get to the end of the flow chart before the start of the next fiscal year. Okay, and so this whole thing is kicked off really, and the hope is that it's done in 8 months, right, from beginning to end. And it kicks off after New Year. On the first Monday of February, the president is supposed to put together a detailed budget proposal, and he puts that detailed budget proposal together with the help of the Office of Management and Budget, a federal agency which helps the president prioritize his spending, think about where he's going to collect taxes and tax revenue from, right? And then looks in detail into what each one of the federal agencies will need in terms of financial support for a 1-year period. So this is the president working together with the Office of Management and Budget. They come up with actually a 5-year proposal, which can be changed, of course, from year to year, because this is a year-to-year process at which they revisit the budget. They have a lot of drafts, a lot of work goes back and forth. The different federal agencies submit reports and requests for budgets, including the Department of Defense and the Department of Education and the FDA, the Food and Drug Administration. All these different agencies are putting together their own requests for money in the next year's budget. These federal agencies kind of go back and forth with the Office of Management and Budget and the President in order to revise these draft budgets for each agency, and then finally the Office of Management and Budget, on behalf of the President, compiles a final budget request. And that budget request here that the President submits to Congress, right, is supposed to be due on the first Monday in February. So now we're kind of in the beginning of February here. Once that budget is submitted to Congress, it goes both to the House of Representatives and to the Senate, who have different committees, and they work together on what are called budget resolutions, or ultimately a budget resolution. And so what they're trying to do is work with the president's priorities and work together both across the House and the Senate, and hopefully across the Democratic and the Republican Party, to come up with some agreement as to what the budgeting priorities for the United States should look like. And so what they're doing is they're working with 12 House appropriations subcommittees and markups, right? Kind of, changing the proposed budget submitted by the president. Exactly the same thing is going on in parallel in the Senate. There are 12 Senate appropriations subcommittees, and they have hearings, and they mark up the draft of the budget also. Okay, and what do these 12 House appropriation subcommittees have to do with? Well, they have to do with the discretionary spending components of the federal budget. So, as I mentioned previously, federal government spending is split into two parts: discretionary spending and mandatory spending. Most of the discretionary spending is what we're working on here in these 12 different House appropriation subcommittees. So we're talking about an appropriation subcommittee for national defense. We're talking about a House appropriation subcommittee for the Environmental Protection Agency, one for education, et cetera, all those different federal government agencies. And the same thing is going on at the Senate. There's communication, you can see with these arrows back and forth between the two, as they work on what is ultimately a budget resolution that they will then submit back to the president in order to have signed into law, hopefully after 8 months. So there's 4 full months in between the time that the new budget is signed and it becomes implemented at the beginning of the fiscal year on October 1st. Okay, that's kind of the flow chart here. So we're moving through the year towards that final budget resolution in the middle of April for these different House budget committees and Senate budget committees. So what happens is eventually the Senate committee on appropriations, they're reviewing and approving and marking up the budget from the president, and the House is doing exactly the same thing. And what they'll do is the House will have a final review, and the Senate will have a final review, and all of those different committees and the results of that budget will be voted on by the House. It'll be voted on by the Senate. There will be discrepancies probably, and if there are discrepancies, then they will go to these conference committees. And the conference committees, that's not where the president is involved in coming up with these compromises. This is where the House of Representatives and the Senate come together and try to resolve any differences in their proposed budgets and markups in terms of funding these 12 different areas of appropriations and discretionary spending. And once they've come to some agreement, then they will submit that budget to the President of the United States. The due date is April 15th. So they're supposed to have this in place on their budget in front of the President. That is to say, Congress, both the House and the Senate have worked on this budget resolution, and that budget resolution is due to the President on April 15th. Then the President can review it and sign it into law, and it will become effective. It will become effective on October 1st, which, as I mentioned, is the beginning of the fiscal year for the federal government. So this is how it's supposed to work. Unfortunately, it doesn't always work this way. We're all familiar with these emergency sessions of Congress where they come together and try to pass some type of a stopgap funding for the government for a certain period of time because the government's going to run out of money, and we're all familiar now with threats of government shutdowns, etc. If this process worked, we wouldn't have to worry about the threat of government shutdowns. So this process really has only works in some years. I mean, it actually has failed to work. I wrote the years down here for you. This whole budgeting process has broken down because of partisanship. In the years 1999, it broke down in 2003. It didn't work in 2005. It didn't work in 2007, 2011, 2015, and it hasn't worked in 2019 or 2020 either. Right? And so whenever this budgeting process fails, we end up with these stopgap measures to fund the government, and we end up with the threat of government shutdown. So this is the way it's supposed to work, but unfortunately, it doesn't actually work this way in practice probably as often as we would hope that it would. Okay, so moving on from the actual budgeting process, what's in that budget? Now let's look at some of the details. where does the federal government get its money from? And I should mention that, there are, of course, states collect taxes and spend money too. We're not going to talk as much about state budgets, I think, really for two reasons. First, the first reason is that there are 50 different states, and looking at the budgeting process and the detail of where each state gets its revenue and what it spends its money on, right, for 50 different states is pretty impractical for an intro macroeconomics class. So, we won't do that. And then also the other reason is that most states, and to my knowledge every state with the exception of Vermont, every state is required as a matter of their state constitution to balance the budget. So they're not going to be running independent fiscal policies in the sense at least of deficit spending or surplus savings. And so, when we think about deficit spending and the debt, we're pretty safe just focusing on the federal government. So I mentioned that also. Okay, so where does the federal government get its money from? Well, it gets its money mostly from individual income taxes, right? So, I'm sure many of you are working or have had a job before, and you're all familiar, right, with paying income taxes. So income taxes represent almost 50% of the revenue that the federal government collects in taxes. Right? So, far and away, this is the most important component of resources for the federal government is the income tax. The income tax, which we'll talk a little bit more about, when JP comes in to our enrichment hour and talks to us about saving and retirement and stuff. He has a whole section there that we're going to talk a little bit about the progressive nature of the federal income tax system for us. The other big component here is also related to the taxes you pay on your paycheck, and it's called payroll taxes. And so that represents about 31.7% here. I'm using 2015 data is readily available. And I could find consistent 2015 data across all the different pie charts that I'm using. So that's about 31% of federal government revenue is payroll taxes. Well, on your pay stub, this is what's called FICA. So there's a contribution that you make up to something a little over $100,000 that you make in terms of these taxes that go to fund Social Security. Okay, and then so these payroll taxes are taxes that go into the Social Security Trust Fund, and they fund the Social Security system. Okay, you make a contribution, and your employer makes an equal contribution. So they're making a contribution on your behalf. Now, really, we all know that if labor supply is relatively inelastic, what your employer is paying you for you in terms of payroll taxes would likely show up in your wage rate if they were not paying that for you. And so the truth is that, you're paying most of that payroll tax, regardless of the legal incidence. The actual economic incidence of paying the tax rests on the employee because labor supply is relatively inelastic. That's just pulling in the concept that you learned about in terms of elasticity in taxes from your microeconomics class, last semester. So then the other big one here that we could talk about here is corporate income taxes. They don't really represent a really large percentage of federal government revenue compared to what individuals pay, both through payroll taxes and individual income taxes. Now, I have a time series chart. We'll see how that's changed over time. Also, there was recently a tax cut, by the Trump administration that was pushed by the GOP that lowered corporate income taxes, which I actually believe is a good idea. I think it's a good idea because a lot of the corporate income can be taxed two times. It can be taxed once on when it's realized as profits by a corporation, and then those profits are paid out to individuals through ownership in stocks or something like that as dividends. Then they get taxed a second time, and it's not very transparent to tax income twice that way. So I think that was a pretty good provision in the law to lower those corporate income taxes. Right, either lower those or eliminate the income tax on dividends when it becomes realized as individual income for households and investors. So the other things that we see in here are sales taxes, very small component of federal government revenue. miscellaneous stuff, and then, obviously, Trump has told us he's a tariff guy. So these customs duties would represent the amount of revenue that we get from collecting those tariffs that he's so fond of. Used to be the case long before the individual income tax and before the Civil War that the federal government got most of its money from tariffs and customs duties, and that's no longer the case. So that's where the federal government gets its money from. We'll take just a look at a time series of individual taxes relative to corporate income taxes and how that's changed over time. Okay, so this is individual and corporate income taxes as a percent of total federal revenue. So it's basically what we saw in the time chart, but there's a time series of that. And so individual income taxes have grown considerably over time in terms of their significance in funding the federal government. And over time, since the end of the Great Depression, corporate income taxes have decreased steadily over that entire time period. Okay. So just a comparison there. So corporate income taxes, it's an important topic, and taxes on corporate income can be viewed as double taxation, and it can even discourage investment perhaps if corporate profits are taxed twice, once at the corporate level, once at the individual level. But certainly from the viewpoint of the overall economy, it is individual workers who are paying most of the taxes, not corporations. Okay, so this spending can be broken down into a couple of different parts. But the two big categories are discretionary spending and mandatory spending. So, like I said before, these are the sort of appropriations, the budget subcommittees for appropriations that we talked about in the flow chart. This is the part of the budget that requires an appropriations bill in that budgeting process. Okay, this is the discretionary spending. Mandatory spending, or non-discretionary spending, is a large part of the budget, and it's not really negotiable unless the law is changed. So this is the part of the budget that cannot be changed through the normal appropriations process. Right? It relates mostly to entitlement programs like Social Security. So Social Security, you're paying in, your employer is paying in on your behalf, and when you pay into the Social Security system, that money is being used to finance the retirement benefits of other people who are currently retired and are using their entitlements. And right now, there's still a surplus of payments into the Social Security system over and above what is required to support current existing entitlements. And that's what we call the Social Security surplus. And it is actually put in what's called the Social Security Trust Fund. And then the money that's in that trust fund is invested in U.S. Treasuries on your behalf. And so, this is what we call a pay-as-you-go Social Security system. I'll say a little bit more about that in a minute. Okay, so anyway, by far, the biggest mandatory spending program is Social Security, as it should be, right? It should be mandatory. I mean, people are paying into this system their whole lives with a promise that it's a pension program, and they're depending on this system to help fund, to help fund them in retirement. And if you paid into a system your whole life and you've been promised benefits, then, by God, you should be able to get those benefits out of the system once you retire, right? And that's why it's mandatory. And it's difficult to change, right? I mean, people who vote, Republican or people who vote Democrat, by and large, don't want to see their Social Security benefits messed with. Okay. So here's the federal budget in 2015, just broadly broken down into mandatory spending, which, like I said, is Medicaid, Medicare, entitlement programs, but it is mostly Social Security spending. That's about 65% of the budget, and it's not negotiable in terms of the normal budgeting process that we outlined in that flow chart. You have to meet these obligations, right? That's 65% of the budget. If you're going to change these priorities, then you're going to have to actually pass a law which says that, hey, we're not going to let people retire until they're 70, or we're going to explicitly cut, retirement benefits in the Social Security system, or we're going to reindex Social Security benefits using, another inflation, another way of measuring inflation like the GDP deflator instead of the Consumer Price Index or something like that. That's all the stuff that would have to be haggled over between the Democrats and the Republicans and be signed into law before we could actually change that mandatory spending. The piece of mandatory spending which is separated out here is interest on the debt. Okay, so, we'll talk more about the debt in the next video, but the debt is basically accumulated deficit. So, we know that right now we're running a large budget deficit of $1 trillion, and we just had a large stimulus package passed. And that stimulus is going to cost about $2 trillion. So adding all of that up, we can expect maybe a $3 trillion deficit. So that deficit is a shortfall of spending, right? A shortfall of revenue compared to spending. And what will happen is that $3 trillion roughly will show up in next year's debt figure, and it will have to be financed. And when that federal debt is financed, the federal government will have to pay interest on it. And that's not negotiable, right? So about 6% of federal government spending just services the existing debt right now. And the larger the debt, right, if revenues aren't growing fast enough to keep up with the growth of the debt, then over time a larger and larger percentage of federal government spending will have to go to this non-discretionary component of spending, which is interest on the federal debt. And that's one of the fears that people who worry about the large debt to GDP ratio have, is that over time, if we grow the debt at a rate faster than the economy is growing, that a larger and larger percentage of the federal government spending will be simply to service the debt rather than fund these other potentially important programs like Social Security, SNAP, Medicare, Medicaid, defense spending, financing, the Department of Education and things like that. Okay, so what this slide does is it takes the mandatory spending and it breaks it down into the different components of mandatory spending. And so the mandatory spending, like I said, is the biggest component is Social Security. And that represents, the total amount in 2015 was $2.45 trillion on mandatory spending, basically entitlement programs. And that's almost a full half of all mandatory spending is on Social Security payments. Right, so Social Security payments include payments to people who have paid into the system, they're retired, and now they're pulling out the money that they are entitled to because they've been paying into the system over the course of their work lives. And the amount that you get out of Social Security depends on a couple of different things. It certainly depends on the amount that you paid into the system. The more you paid into the system, the more you get out of the system. It also depends on how long you wait until you apply for the benefits. So the longer you wait, right, the more that you will receive when you actually decide that you want to start receiving your Social Security benefits. A lot of people who do financial planning will tell you that you should save up money in a 401k and have all of your own personal savings and really run through those personal savings first so that when you actually turn around to get Social Security, you'll have the largest possible Social Security check that you can get. Once you start receiving that Social Security check, you're guaranteed to continue to receive that amount in your Social Security check until you die. And so, that's not bad financial planning advice. So there's Social Security, about half of mandatory spending. Medicare and health spending is about 38%. So those two together are really a bulk of this mandatory spending. There are mandatory spendings on food and agriculture. Farmers in the United States get a lot of federal government support through price floors that are enforced by the government in order to protect those industries. There are veterans benefits which are considered mandatory, and then there's some other miscellaneous stuff here too. Okay, so that is your mandatory spending. This is your a pie chart in the same year for your discretionary spending, and by far the largest component of discretionary spending is the military. That's about 54% of $1.11 trillion in 2015 on discretionary spending. Other components, right? These would be, some of the broader aggregated areas of appropriations that we talked about in the budgeting process, right? The Department of Education, Department of Veterans Benefits or Veterans Affairs, Housing and Community and HUD and those types of government agencies, International Affairs and the State Department, Energy and the Environment like the EPA, Science, NASA, those types of priorities, etc., right? And so all of these things are components of discretionary spending. And the biggest one that we have to think about here, of course, is the 54% that goes to the military. That is by far the largest component of discretionary spending. Okay. And, you know, in terms of dollars, you know, roughly similar to what we see on Social Security. So Social Security and Medicare and Medicaid together certainly are you know, a larger overall component of spending overall than military spending. Okay, so that's the first objective covered, and we have a pretty good idea now of the budgeting process. We know that the budgeting process doesn't always work. In fact, in recent years it hasn't worked very well at all because of partisanship in Washington, and we know now you know, sort of at least broadly where the government gets its money from and what the government spends its money on, and you know that the expenditures are broken broadly into discretionary and non-discretionary spending, and that budgeting process is determining how this discretionary, the funds available for discretionary spending are distributed across these types of priorities. Okay. All right. So, you know what I'm going to do? I'm actually going to take a break. I'm going to cover this chapter in 3 different videos, so we'll cover it just sort of one objective at a time. I'm going to let it go there for now, and I'll come back soon and talk about objective number 2, and we'll talk about, you know, sort of how we define a deficit and a surplus. We'll go through some of the accounting terms. We'll talk in a little bit more detail about the Social Security system and how that works, and what I mean when I say it's a pay-as-you-go pension system. And then we'll look at least 2 different views of how to measure the deficit. I will do a calculation of these views for you, and then we'll even take a moment with some response, clicker type response questions so that you can practice these calculations on your own. So I'll see you again soon.